Welcome back to the FIDE women's candidates. Anna Muzychuk stands alone at the top with 4 points, a full point ahead of a tightly packed chasing group. Divya Deshmukh, Vishali Rameshbabu, Alexandra Goryachkina, Katerina Logno, and Gina Zhu all sit on 3 points, meaning every game in round 6 could completely reshape the standings. With so many players within striking distance of the leader, today's decisive games carry enormous weight. Let's get into it. Bibisara, Assaubayeva is a sharp, tactically alert player who loves unbalanced positions and is never afraid to go for complications. Divya Deshmukh is a rising Indian talent known for her deep preparation and precise technique. Both players enter this game on 5 and 0 points respectively, making this a must-win situation for Assaubayeva and a golden chance for Divya to chase down the leader. The game opens with the Queen's Gambit declined, steering into the Cambridge Springs defense with the Yugoslav variation. This is a classic, deeply theoretical system that has been employed by world champions from Botvinnik to Karpov. The defining feature is Black's early queen sortie to a 5, creating immediate pressure on the queen side and forcing White to handle the tension carefully. The resulting positions are rich with strategic complexity. White opens with the queen's pawn, staking a claim to the center and signaling a positional, strategic battle from the very first move. Black responds symmetrically, immediately contesting the center. This is the most principled reply, establishing a solid foothold on d5. The Queen's Gambit. White immediately challenges Black's central pawn, inviting a fight for the d5 square that will define the entire game. Black declines the gambit and supports the d5 pawn with e6, choosing the solid Queen's Gambit declined. This closes the light-squared bishop temporarily, but keeps the center very secure. White develops the knight to its most natural square, preparing to castle kingside and adding another defender to the center. Black mirrors the development, bringing the knight to f6 where it attacks e4 and prepares further piece activity. Both sides are following the main lines of classical theory. White brings the second knight to c3, solidly reinforcing the c4 pawn and preparing to pin Black's knight with bg5. Black plays c6. The move that signals the Cambridge Springs defense. This prepares the queen excursion to a 5 and gives the position its distinctive character. White pins the knight on f6, which is the standard way to meet the Cambridge Springs setup. This pin creates long-term pressure and can become very annoying for Black to handle. Black supports the pinned knight with the queen's knight, preparing to break the pin by developing the bishop and eventually freeing the position. White solidifies the center with e3, completing the classical pawn triangle and preparing to develop the light-squared bishop. And here it is, the defining move of the Cambridge Springs. The queen leaps to a 5, attacking the c3 knight and the g5 bishop simultaneously. This active queen placement gives Black immediate counterplay and was a favorite weapon of players like Miguel Najdorf. White releases the central tension by capturing on d5. This is the Yugoslav variation, choosing to clarify the pawn structure rather than maintain the complex tension. Black recaptures with the knight, centralizing it on d5 where it sits powerfully. The knight will soon become a target, however. White tucks the rook onto the c-file, preparing to recapture on c3 with the rook if the knight is exchanged. This is the key idea in the Yugoslav variation. Black captures on c3, forcing a structural concession from White. This exchange is thematic in the Cambridge Springs, giving Black the bishop pair and creating doubled pawns on the c-file. White recaptures with the b-pawn rather than the rook, choosing to keep the rook on c1 and instead create a passed pawn potential on the queen side. The doubled c-pawns look awkward, but the a-pawn is now semi-open, a bold diagonal for the bishop. Black places it on a 3, immediately threatening to trade it off and weaken White's queenside pawn structure further. White defends the c3 pawn by doubling on the c-file via the rook lift to c2. Keeping the structure intact and preventing the bishop from taking, Black strikes in the center with c5, challenging White's d4 pawn and opening lines for the pieces. This is an energetic choice, keeping the position dynamic. White develops the bishop to d3, pointing it aggressively toward the kingside and preparing to castle. A natural developing move in this structure. Black captures on d4, opening the position further and forcing White to make a decision about the pawn structure. The engine notes this as a moment where the evaluation shifts and Black begins to seize the initiative. White recaptures with the e-pawn, restoring the central pawn and keeping a strong pawn on d4. The position now has a clear pawn majority on the kingside for White. Black prepares to develop the light-squared bishop via b7, connecting the rooks and giving the bishop an active diagonal aimed at the center. White repositions the bishop to e4, a powerful central square where it eyes the h7 pawn and controls key dark squares, an ambitious regrouping. Black prepares to develop the bishop to b7, and the rook comes to b8 to support the eventual b5 break or simply connect the rooks. White swings the bishop to f4, keeping it active and avoiding any exchanges that might simplify the position in Black's favor. The bishop finally emerges on its natural diagonal to b7, where it becomes a powerful long-range piece pointing toward the kingside and controlling the long diagonal. White exchanges bishops, removing Black's powerful b7 bishop. This simplifies the position slightly and takes away one of Black's key pieces. Black recaptures with the rook, immediately activating it on the b-file where it will support queenside counterplay. White centralizes the queen to d3, a solid square from which it can both support the kingside and monitor the queenside. The position remains roughly balanced. Black castles kingside, bringing the king to safety and connecting the rooks. Both sides are now ready to enter the middle game proper. White also castles, completing development. The position is roughly equal and both sides must now find a plan. Black activates the rook on the c-file, eyeing the isolated c3 pawn. This is a thematic rook placement in these structures. White advances the c-pawn, trying to gain space on the queen side and activate the pieces. This also threatens to create a passed pawn in the future. Black repositions the knight from d7 toward g6, beginning a maneuver to activate it on the kingside where it can support an attack. White centralizes the queen further to e4, an aggressive square from which it threatens to create kingside pressure. Black reroutes the queen to a6, where it eyes the d3 diagonal and keeps pressure on White's queenside pawns. White launches a kingside pawn advance with h4, intending to create space and attacking chances against Black's king. The plan is to push this pawn as a battering ram. Black repositions the rook to e7, connecting the major pieces and preparing to double on the d-file or support central counterplay. White retreats the queen back to d3, regrouping. The queen had fewer prospects on e4 and now it eyes the a6f1 diagonal. Black transfers the rook to d7, centralizing it and piling pressure on the d4 pawn. The engine notes this as a moment where Black's advantage grows significantly to nearly a full pawn. White pushes the h-pawn to h5, continuing the kingside advance, but the engine notes this may not be the most accurate. Black's grip on the center is growing, and Stockfish sees White's position slipping slightly here. Black brings the bishop to d6, a powerful central square where it targets h2 and supports the overall kingside setup. The engine registers a significant swing here, with Black's advantage climbing toward 3/4 of a pawn. White trades off the powerful bishop on d6, preferring to eliminate the threat rather than allow it to dominate the position. Black recaptures with the rook, further centralizing. The rook on d6 is now a monster, eyeing both flanks. White advances the pawn to h6, trying to create a nagging weakness in Black's kingside pawn structure by lodging the pawn deep in enemy territory. Black captures, forced. The pawn structure on the kingside is now altered, and White hopes to generate threats against the weakened king. The knight leaps to e5, a powerful outpost in the center. From here it eyes d7, c6, and f7, creating multiple threats. Black activates the knight to g6, challenging the e5 outpost and bringing the knight into the game on the kingside. White swings the queen to e3, supporting the e5 knight and keeping options open. The evaluation has now swung back to near equality. Black repositions the queen to b7, keeping pressure on the d4 pawn and threatening queenside counterplay along the b-file. White pushes the c-pawn to c5, trying to advance the passed pawn and create a dangerous outside passer. This is White's main hope for counterplay. Black blocks the passed pawn with the rook on d5, an excellent defensive move that simultaneously eyes the e5 knight. White advances the pawn again to c6, pushing deeper into Black's position. The pawn is becoming a genuine threat. Black retreats the queen to e7, keeping coordination and preparing to deal with the c6 pawn. The engine notes a very slight improvement in Black's position here. White pushes f4, adding another attacking pawn to the kingside and supporting the e5 knight. This shows White is committed to a two-front assault. Black attacks the c6 pawn with the rook, creating a pin and forcing White to deal with the queenside before pushing further. This is a key turning point. White plays g3 to support a potential f5 push, but the engine swings by a full pawn here toward black. The move creates a slight loosening of the kingside that black will exploit. White needed to consolidate rather than continue pushing. Black finds a powerful queen move to b4, attacking the d4 pawn and the a3 bishops simultaneously. However, the engine flags this as a mistake as it lets white off the hook slightly. The evaluation remains clearly in black's favor, but the advantage shrinks. White responds by defending with the rook to c4, blocking the queen's attack on d4 and also protecting the rook. The position remains tense. Black retreats the queen back to e7, and the engine again flags this as inaccurate. The back and forth queen moves are costing black some of the advantage that was built up. A more direct continuation would have maintained greater pressure. White repositions the rook back to c2, maintaining the defense of the c6 pawn. The position remains a grind. Black goes back to b4 with the queen again, repeating the same idea. The engine notes this is again inaccurate, and the evaluation continues to oscillate in what is becoming a frustrating sequence for black. White follows suit and plays rc4 again. Both sides are essentially repeating moves in a complex position, but black is failing to convert the advantage. Black retreats again to e7, and this time the engine is essentially satisfied, seeing near equality. The three repetitions have dissipated much of black's earlier advantage. White retreats the rook as well, and the engine notes a significant swing back toward black here. White has missed a chance to consolidate, and the position is becoming difficult again. Black retreats the queen all the way to d8, a surprising regrouping that suggests a new plan. The queen re-enters the game from a different angle. White pushes f5 aggressively, trying to open lines on the kingside. The pawn advance is double-edged as it also weakens the e5 square. Black captures the e5 knight, eliminating white's powerful outpost piece. This is an important simplification that changes the character of the position. White recaptures with the d-pawn, creating a powerful passed e-pawn, but also opening the d-file. The evaluation is now slightly in black's favor. Black seizes the open d-file with the rook, invading on the first rank. This active rook placement gives black significant counterplay, and the engine notes a swing in black's direction. This is a serious error. White plays rf2, but the engine swings by over a full pawn here toward black. The rook needed to stay more active. By retreating to f2, white allows black's rook to remain dangerously active on d1, and black's counterplay becomes overwhelming. Black captures the f1 rook with check, but the engine flags this as a mistake, as it gives up the powerful d1 rook for a less active piece. A more patient approach would have maintained a larger advantage. The evaluation shrinks after this capture. White recaptures with the rook, and suddenly the position has simplified considerably, with both sides having just one rook each. Black activates the queen to g5, threatening to check on g2 and eyeing the e5 pawn. The queen is suddenly very dangerous on this diagonal. White retreats the queen to d3, trying to defend, but the engine notes a significant swing here. Black's queen and rook are coordinating powerfully, and white is struggling to find adequate defense. Black finally captures the c6 pawn with the rook, removing the annoying passed pawn. The engine flags this as another mistake, though, as a more forcing continuation existed. White's position was already very difficult, but this allows some defensive resources. White pushes f6 with great energy, trying to create counterplay and threatening to promote. The pawn on f6 is extremely dangerous, and the engine notes white's resources are far from exhausted. The evaluation swings dramatically as this pawn becomes a real weapon. Black retreats the rook to c8, and this is flagged as a significant mistake by the engine, with the evaluation swinging massively in white's favor. Black needed to deal with the f6 pawn more directly. After c8, white's passed pawns on e5 and f6 become extremely powerful. White activates the rook to d1, bringing it into the game and threatening to invade further. The game is now a race between black's queenside pieces and white's advancing pawns. Black moves the king to h8, stepping off the g8 square, but the engine again registers a large swing. The king is walking into danger, and black's defensive resources are being depleted rapidly. White moves the king to g2, removing it from any backrank tricks and consolidating the position. A sensible king move in a complex endgame. Black pushes h5, trying to create some counterplay on the kingside, but the engine flags this as another imprecision, and the evaluation swing shows black's position is deteriorating rapidly. White's connected passed pawns on e5 and f6 are simply too powerful. White centralized the queen to d2, eyeing the h6 pawn and supporting the advancing passed pawns. The queen coordinates beautifully with the rook on d1. Black swings the queen to g4, creating threats and trying to activate, but this is flagged as a major mistake, with the engine showing an enormous swing. Black's attack is insufficient and the defensive resources are simply gone. White transfers the rook to e1, supporting the e5 pawn and preparing to push it forward. The rook and queen combine perfectly to support the advancing pawns. Black continues pushing the h-pawn, trying desperately to create a passed pawn of their own and generate some counterplay. The evaluation swing here is enormous, showing Black's position is fundamentally lost. White repositions the rook to e3, preparing to support the f6 and e5 pawns further, and also potentially to swing to g3 to deal with any kingside threats. Black activates the rook to g8, trying to create threats against the white king, but this is flagged as yet another inaccuracy with another large swing. The rook on g8 has no real target and White's position is simply winning. White centralizes the queen to d7, a devastating square from which it ties down Black's pieces. The queen threatens to support the f6 pawn's advance and controls critical squares. The evaluation jumps significantly in White's favor. Black plays the queen to f4, the final mistake that seals Black's fate. The engine registers an enormous swing here, confirming that Black's position is completely lost. The queen attacks g3, but White has resources to deal with everything. After this move, Black resigned, unable to cope with White's advancing pawns and dominating pieces. What an extraordinary game! Divya played a deeply theoretical Cambridge Springs defense and gradually outplayed Assaubayeva through careful maneuvering. However, the game swung wildly in-game as both players made inaccuracies in time pressure. Ultimately, Divya's superior in-game technique prevailed, and Assaubayeva's queenside pawns, which looked so threatening, ultimately came to nothing against Black's coordinated pieces. And that wraps up the decisive action from round 6 of the FIDE women's candidates. The standings remain tight as we head into round 7, and the pressure is only going to increase. Who will emerge from this chasing pack to challenge Muzachuk? Let us know in the comments who you think is the favorite, and do not forget to subscribe for full round coverage.